You need to be born again.
I am born again.
Now, did you just say that you are Lucifer?
I am Lucifer.
Of course, what happens in nature is just as the sun gets to the lowest, it begins to go back up, okay? So the sun is always going up. Light is conquering darkness, good, evil, life, death. And the sun, as it ascends into the sky, it is reborn. God sends his son, S-O-N, as a sign of his love and his affirmation.
Yeah, Mason Bible. Totally demonic. Sun God. Ra. Amen. The Father of God. The Creator.
I am Lucifer.
The beginning text of the Saucer Judgements begins with verse 1, and the statement, quote, "And I heard a great sound out of the dwelling, saying to the 7 messengers, Go and pour out the saucers of the wrath of God into the land." End quote. As we have continued to point out, the term is messengers, instead of angels, land, instead of earth, and saucers instead of bowls, which is still a bowl, but a particular kind of bowl. The specificity of what kind of bowl the bowl is, in other words, that it is a saucer, is important. The astronomical data from Aquarius is most commonly depicted pouring out water from a cistern. But the term saucer is overlaid on the imagery. If you look at a typical saucer from the ancient Middle East in John's day, this is what it will look like. If you look at it pouring something out, this is what it would look like. If you take the common artistic depictions of the 7 bowl judgments, complete with messengers as Nikes, and show them being poured out, this is what it would look like. Once the image of a saucer is inverted as though it is poured out, it becomes incredibly familiar looking. The reason it becomes so familiar to modern audiences is because everyone knows what that looks like. It is a commonly observed phenomena. It is such a commonly observed thing that unless you have been living under a rock, you will have no problem identifying exactly what that is, despite the fact they are called UFOs, which stand for unidentified flying objects. Because previously, they were known by the term flying saucers. And they aren't exactly unidentified. This is how a California witness of a UFO sighting looked like. Some think they have identified them in religious art from the Middle Ages, such as Carlo Crivelli's depiction of the Annunciation with Saint Emitius from 1486 AD, or from the Renaissance depiction of the Baptism of Christ by Ertegelder, both showing what is now commonly observed shapes in the sky to modern people. And according to skeptics and critics, these now very familiar shapes are the creation of artistic coincidence in stylizing the shapes in art, and nothing more. No one really knows what the inspiration for those shapes might have been because the artists are no longer alive to be interviewed about them. So it is a matter of speculation as to what inspired their odd familiar shapes. But nobody is really happy about the comparisons. On July 2, 1968, the U.S. House of Representatives, 90th Congress, Second Session, held a hearing on the Committee on Science and Astronautics, in which the committee presented every description of what was being seen in the sky as unidentified flying objects, which you now see on your screen. There were a total of 63 variations of descriptions. But when you identify which descriptions looked like a saucer pouring out, or, in other words, an upside-down bowl, 54 of the 63 objects overlapped John's description. That is a full 85%. That means that according to the U.S. Congressional Record, as of 1968, 85% of the objects actually observed in the heavens were saucers exactly as John had prophesied. The government opted to fraudulently tell the public they were really seeing swamp gas. Even though swamp gas doesn't appear on anyone's radar. And these did. So the government's lie was an obvious cover story. If you look at a comprehensive list of UFOs throughout history, you will discover that while they have happened before in history, they were extremely rare before 947 AD, occurring only a handful of times prior to the 1800s, and never assuming the shape of a saucer until as late as the 1880s, when flying saucers began to be seen all over the world. The phenomena peaked in the 1900s to the 1950s, at around the same time historically that the real saucer judgments were being fulfilled. As you see in the chart on your screen, which shows every major documented report in history, extending all the way back to 1400 BC. The Pentagon has reported that while flying saucers are completely real, there is absolutely no evidence that they are alien in origin. As you see in this NBC report, entitled "The New UFO Report to Congress Shows No Evidence of Aliens." Of course. And in this report from Politico, entitled "Government Report Can't Explain UFOs but Offers No Evidence of Aliens." And in this report, entitled "UFOs Pose Real Danger Says Pentagon, but Aliens Aren't to Blame, Probably." The reason they have concluded there is real danger involved in flying saucers is explained in the following article from thedailymail.com, entitled "UFO Sightings Have Left Witnesses with Radiation Burns, Brain Damage and Perceived Time Suspension," according to interviews in newly released Pentagon report from 2010. The saucers from heaven people are now seeing are the one and the same saucers from heaven that pour out the wrath of God that John prophesied 2,000 years ago. All the things you have seen in this video series are all the same things, which are completely obvious and are fulfilled in plain sight. From 666 to fire from heaven to the mark on the forehead, and now to even the bowl or saucer judgments themselves. You cannot claim you did not see God's wrath in the saucer judgments, because they were seen by everyone, everywhere, all over the world. The first saucer judgment occurs in verse 2, which reads as follows, quote, "And away went the first, and poured his saucer upon the land, and it caused a worthless and painful ulcer upon those who held to the mark of the beast, and kissed his icon." End quote. The first saucer judgment began shortly after the early 1800s, on February 19, in 1806. As Mars, or Ma'adim in Hebrew, entered Aquarius, the sign in the heavens revealed the sun in Aquarius, with the blackened moon, in the pouring out action of Aquarius. The skin ulceration described by John as the first saucer judgment is commonly known, in modern medicine, as melanoma. Melanoma comes from the Greek words, melanos, which means black, and oma, which is the Greek word for with. John's description of the sore on the skin, that it was very painful and troublesome, eliminated most possibilities, and narrowed it down to some form of cancer. Because cancer is the most obvious candidate for the description of painful and troublesome sores on the skin, which is widespread, and also one on the skin, due to the sun's exposure. And this was the target of John's prophecies in chapter 16. And given the clear description of Apollyon, the sun god, as the false Christ of the Antichrist, in chapter 9 verse 11, citing Roman sun worship, it makes this identification an extremely easy one. If you simply Google the phrase, "medical results of sun exposure," in Google Chrome, the Google search will return the explanation from the National Institute of Health, that, quote, "Over time, UV damage can take a toll on your skin and its underlying connective tissue. As a result, your skin may develop more wrinkles and lines. Too much sun exposure can also raise your risk for skin cancer, the most common type of cancer in the United States." End quote. It is called the most common type of cancer in the country. Medicine now distinguishes 3 different types of skin cancer caused by the sun because they are so frequent. Ironically, there are predominantly 3, aside from the rare disease variations. Those 3 are basal cell carcinoma, squamous cell carcinomas, and melanoma. The distinctions in types of skin cancer allow for medical science to distinguish the varieties of treatment that must be used for each of the skin cancers produced by the sun. But the most common serious form of skin cancer is singled out as melanoma. The famous Center for Disease Control, also known as the CDC, lists exposure to the sun as the primary cause of skin cancer. In the CDC's article, entitled Basic Information About Skin Cancer, in the very first paragraph on its website states, quote, "The most preventable cause of skin cancer is overexposure to ultraviolet UV light, either from the sun or from artificial sources like tanning beds." End quote. So, how do you know John is referring to this disease, in particular, and not something else? A lot of diseases produce sores on the skin. How do you know it is specifically melanoma, or skin cancer sores, in general? If you pay attention to what he tells you in this text, and the surrounding texts in this chapter, and in the other texts in this book as a whole, the answer to that question is, there will be no doubt that John was referring to this unmistakable disease that is uniquely afflicting, in epidemic proportions, this very period in history, known as the Saucer Judgements. The first proof John is describing melanoma or skin cancer comes from what he identifies that the 666, the Antichrist, the beast, false prophet and dragon all worship. He names the deity as the sun god of the Roman Empire, born on December 25th, which John names as Apollo. He says they have Apollo as their king. That is why Revelation chapter 9, verse 11, had to be hid by counter-reformationists. And Jerome literally fabricated his own verse and fraudulently inserted it into the Latin Vulgate, to hide the historical connection. Sun worship was a major feature of the replacement Christ, invented by the Roman Empire, to take his place. They marked his birth on December 25th, in a hybridization with Apollo, as the birth of the sun, and they marked his resurrection, not by Passover, but by the position of the sun, in the spring equinox. Both his birth and his resurrection were marked by solar events, heralded by the sun. The sun's solstice, or birth, and the sun's equinox, or resurrection, in the spring. And obviously, this future replacement played a major role in John's actual real prophecies because it was so egregious, and it played a major role in the Church of England's doctrine of the text, in the English translation of the Textus Receptus, and even Rome's doctrine of the text, in the Latin Vulgate itself. Theological spin doctrine that would have never even been needed if things had been done honestly. The second proof is in chapter 14, where he cites the replacement of the blood of Christ with what he calls the wine of Babylon. Babylon was the historical source for sun worship, and also its opposition against the Jews. The Tower of Babel, or what was actually the Tower of Babylon, was historically a ziggurat, and it was dedicated to its worship of the sun. And thus when John called this replacement of Passover the wine of Babylon, he was citing its actual Babylonian roots. Roman Catholicism has literally mentioned on numerous occasions and in numerous sources, they considered Babylon, historically, to be the origin of their religion. Down to even the detail of the design of the cathedral architecture. The third proof is in the surrounding prophecies of chapter 16. All of which feature a focus on disastrous consequences of the false religion of Rome, in their worship of the sun, which they have replaced God with. And every judgment, like the plagues of Egypt, focus on a rebuke of its false god, which you will see more of in each text. The fourth proof is found in the actual literal language of the first saucer judgment. He mentions it as a painful and troublesome ulceration of the skin. Not necessarily deadly, but clearly very painful, and certainly life-threatening, because the response to it is to blaspheme God. When it develops, he says that it is punishment for those who take the mark, which is on the hand or the forehead, and those who kiss his icon, which is on the lips. The mark is placed on the skin, and is made of black ash, as you have seen. So God sends a sore on the skin, and it is also likewise black, in response. The forehead, the hand and the lips, are the most frequent location for these sores, because these are all areas that are the most exposed to the sun. The fifth proof is seen in the sign in the heavens, the black moon is being poured out, with the Sun and Mars in Aquarius. And in this very year, that the sign of the first saucer appeared, medical history was made. It was the first time in history that the term melanoma was coined medically, and melanoma became a separate recognized and named disease. But that was not the only thing that happened in history. After this time in history, the frequency of the disease itself exploded exponentially into a full-blown modern epidemic. As you can see from the charts on your screen. This is a chart from the New England Journal of Medicine, showing the increase in melanoma just since 1975. This chart is a chart from Finland showing the exponential increase in melanoma just from the year 2000 to 2013. This is a chart from the National Cancer Institute showing the increase in melanoma since 1973. And this chart is a chart produced by the World Health Organization on the increase in melanoma in female Europeans since 1940. And this chart, which is a chart produced by the Berger Medical Research Institute, shows the increase in melanoma from 1980 to 2018 in Australia, Scotland and the United States. As you can see, the numbers are going through the roof on melanoma skin cancer. But an interesting statistical fact was discovered about melanoma skin cancers in the modern global cancer research produced by the World Health Organization. This is a map of the most densely Catholic countries on Earth, from the least being gray to the most heavily Catholic, being the deepest red. It is interesting to see where Roman Catholicism has made the most impact on the population numbers of all these countries on Earth. The former Protestant country of the United States is now a solidly Roman Catholic country, thanks to the work of Protestant counter-reformationists, who really should probably be viewed as traitors to the founders of the United States for the disservice that they've done. Now, you see a heat map of the occurrence of melanoma worldwide, produced by the World Health Organization. The lowest occurrence is shown in the light orange, going to the highest occurrence, shown in the deepest reds. It is shaded with the same colors as the worldwide Catholicism map, except a light density shades to gray on the religion map, but shades to light orange on the melanoma map. And that is the only difference in the color schemes of those two maps. But when you see them side by side, an amazingly random demographic parallel begins to emerge. The maps look almost identical, even though one is about religion and the other is about melanoma. As incredible as it seems, if you do a side-by-side comparison, you will see the same tendencies in every continent on the globe. Here is a comparison of these two maps by each continent. The first continent map is a comparison of North America. The word Anglican is noted on the religion map because Canada is still a subject of the Church of England, and the Church of England has merged with the Vatican and now accepts the papacy as the head of its Christianity. So there is no difference between the word Catholic and Anglican. When you look to the comparison on the melanoma map, you see an almost identical density in the global occurrence of melanoma. This is South America. This is Europe. The pink color is Russia and its former Soviet satellite states. The reason it is shaded pink on the religion map is that those areas are predominantly Eastern Orthodox, but as in the case of the Church of England, they have reunited with the Vatican as well, and are functionally the same as Catholicism. And you see this reflected when you look at the heat map for melanoma. This is Africa. This is Australia and New Zealand, who are both subjects of the British Empire and the Church of England. And this is the Middle East. The maps look almost identical to one another. You can't hardly tell which one is the Catholic density map from which one is the map of melanoma incidence, with only a few slight variations. According to the scripture, this relationship is not coincidental. It is the prophecy of the first saucer judgment. And incidentally, it is also no accident that cancer has been reported to have been connected to flying saucer sightings. Some scientists have attempted to explain this phenomena as a result of strong electromagnetic fields, or the radiation burns on the skin, that they experienced. This is an article on that topic, from a serious medical journal. Whatever the cause, prophetically speaking, it is not surprising this effect is also described by John as the first saucer judgment. In verses 3 through 7, John's text describes the second and third saucer judgments. The reason we are covering them together is that both the second and the third judgment are simply variations of the same plague. One occurring in the sea, and the other occurring in the lakes and rivers. Both leading to the death of all manner or kind of marine life, contaminated with the biochemical effects of the saucer plagues. Verses 3 through 7 read as follows, in our uncensored translation of the Textus Receptus. Quote, "And the second messenger poured his saucer into the sea and caused it to become blood-like, and all manner of breathing life died in the sea. And the third messenger poured out his saucer into the rivers and founts of water, and they became blood-like. And I heard the messenger of the waters saying, You are just, Yahweh, the one who is, and the one who was, and the one who is holy, because you have judged these things. Because they have poured out the blood of the holy and prophets, you have given them blood to drink. For they deserve it. And I heard another out of the altar saying, Yes, Yahweh, El Shaddai, true and equitable are your judgments." End quote. The signs in the heavens, for the second judgment came on August 14, in 1844, with Neptune in Aquarius, accompanied with a spectacular show of 5 simultaneous meteor showers. As stated in the text, John is repeatedly associating meteor showers with the martyrs, wearing white robes, as done, in his previous texts, in Revelation. The southern Omicron Aquarid meteor showers were positioned in the very stream of the pouring out of Aquarius. Then on April 20, 1878, the sign for the third saucer judgment occurred, featuring the coming of Venus to Aquarius, with the appearance of the Theta Aquarid meteor shower, thus constituting the second and third saucer judgments. Because of John's description that the phenomenon looked like blood, but wasn't, and that it resulted in killing all kinds of marine life, modern audiences know exactly what John was describing. It is known today by the colloquial name as red tide, or what later became more scientifically known as toxic harmful algae bloom. And there is a lot to unpack concerning this saucer judgment, because so much disinformation propaganda has surrounded it. If you have believed what most people have been told about this oceanic phenomena, you have been completely deceived, once again. And we will show you the very latest and up-to-date scientific research and timeline history of this phenomena, so you will no longer be deceived about what is happening. Deceivers on this topic have a multitude of different motivations, unlike some of the other previous events in history, which were mainly or primarily political, economic and theological evasion, and not much else. It was primarily to provide cover for the Vatican and its political and economic agenda. But deceivers about red tide have numerous and diverse motivations, but they too can be traced back to political and economic lies. The disinformation they traffic in to attain those political and economic goals are the same typical deceptions that have always been used by operatives of Vatican propaganda. Red tide is a shockingly bizarre and devastating saucer judgment, and if you don't believe that to be the case, then just keep living. There is nothing normal about it. It is not a routine occurrence. It is not naturally produced by nature alone. It is not inconsequential in its effect, either to the economy or to the oceanic ecosystem. It is a second saucer judgment, and it is fully living up to precisely what John prophesied about it. That is, his real prophecy, not the one he is contorted to have written for the spectacular superstitious fantasies of counter-Reformation eschatology. The bold-faced liars and propagandists who seek to economically and politically gain from the propaganda about it are manifold. There is the tourism industry, which can be devastated by it. There is the fishing industry, which is at risk of going out of business. There is the agricultural industry, which is threatened, politically and economically. There is the raw materials and production industry, which is also threatened. There is the political crowd, who wants to run on political platforms and policies, which routinely lie about it, in order to seek to minimize it. And, last, but not least, there is always, the ever-faithful counter-Reformation theological crowd, which always gravitates, to exactly and precisely the wrong explanation, and vote for precisely the wrong policy, because they simply refuse to believe, or at least admit, that their propaganda is a flat-out, intentional deception. But their theological counter-Reformation eschatological fantasies fall in the face of scientific facts that once again expose them as the habitual liars that they always prove to be. The only reason scientists have been recruited by government to study this problem is because the interests protected by the many bold-faced liars have been weighed in the balance and found wanting. And the interests of the economy, which government is now having to pay for with tax money, now outweigh the value of the deception that protected and hid the deceivers. It has become, economically, too huge an expense for government to ignore. So it is simply because of the overwhelming weight of the economy that the value of the deceivers in the modern era have simply vanished. We will look at the historical timeline of what has actually been the real history of this oceanic phenomena. We will look at the hard mathematical statistics of what is actually really happening. And we will look at all the science, consensus-based explanations for why and how it is really happening. And finally, we will look at John's explanation for why his exact and precise prophecy is really happening. When we are done with these explanations, there should be no doubt in your thinking that this is real. It is shocking. And it is a second and third saucer judgment in today's present world. With no rapture, and complete with the biblical Antichrist already present in the present world, on whom they are pronounced. There are 4 lies that are routinely perpetrated by counter-Reformationist propagandists to hide the fact they are followers of the Antichrist, and they are under the direct judgment of God. In order to hide this fact, they will tell the public the following bold-faced lies. And they will tell them these lies, even when they know better, but they will keep repeating these lies, as long as anyone will still believe them. These lies are as follows. 1. There is no Antichrist until after the rapture. Or, it was nothing more than Nero. In the past, we have already discussed this lie rather extensively. 2. Red tide is nothing new, and has always been here. 3. It is natural oceanic phenomena and happens every year. Therefore, there is nothing to worry about. 4. And, it only happens in Florida, or, at the most, the Gulf of Mexico. So this is not the second and third bowl judgments on the Antichrist. End of story. Nothing to see here. And they have official government sources to cite, supporting their claims. The first example is from an info slide produced by the state of Florida. It clearly tells you there is nothing to this. It leads with, quote, red tide is a natural event that occurs nearly every year. End quote. So that settles that, doesn't it? Then the slide follows the second line, with the proof that it is a natural event, and occurs nearly every year, by stating, quote, anecdotal reports from Spanish explorers go back as far as the 16th century. Wow, well that settles it, doesn't it? Those are the only 2 statements you need to know. Because everything after that reduces it to, ho-hum. It's just nature, and happens every year. Nothing to see here. It is so good of the state of Florida to get that information out to the public, to assure them there is absolutely nothing to be worried about. And here's a nice video, produced by Ringling College of Art and Design, assuring the public it is nothing, complete with some very nice video, and even a music track.
The name of America's Sunshine State, Florida, often conjures the mental image of a coast flocked with palm trees and tourists. But Florida is also known for something else, that falls out of the frame of this mental image. This aquatic phenomenon, generally exclusive to the Gulf of Mexico, is a harmful algal bloom that can only occur when three conditions are met. First, microscopic algae known as Karenia brevis have to be present in the water. With that, there must be a brew of natural or manufactured nutrients to serve as a source of algal sustenance. And third, the physical conditions must be right to concentrate and propagate the bloom. Florida red tide is not an oceanic byproduct of human civilization, as many of you may think. In fact, the birthplace of Florida red tide lies 10 to 40 miles offshore, far from human pollution. However, it is the runoff and sewage that helps sustain a bloom as it migrates inshore. While the Florida red tide may appear to be an evil of the Gulf, it is a natural part of the ecosystem. Blooms have occurred in Florida for hundreds of years, and long before humans developed the coastlines. To learn more about red tides, please visit these links.
Isn't it good that you now know it is a purely natural occurrence that has happened for hundreds of years in Florida? And it is absolutely nothing to worry about. Yeah, that's a relief, isn't it? But, unfortunately, everything you have just been told and led to believe in these presentations are misinformation, or actually, really, just pure disinformation. The difference between misinformation is that while it is incorrect, it is not necessarily intentional. Whereas, disinformation is distinguished by the fact it is the intentional attempt to promote a known lie. The actual definition of disinformation given by Google from dictionary.com is, quote, false information, which is intended to mislead, especially propaganda, issued by a government organization to a rival power or the media. The emphasis in the definition is that it is intentional false information issued by a government organization. But it is not restricted to just government organizations. Disinformation can come from both public, corporate or even private sources. And it can have any motive. Economically, politically or even theologically. And theologically is naturally the worst and most wicked kind, because it seeks to pass off a lie in God's name, where you least expect it to come from. If you do not know what counter-reformationists really are, with preachers, it is intentional, because they spend several hours every week studying these topics, and even if they are really stupid ministers. And there are some vastly and incredibly stupid ministers, they can avoid running into factual information that points to the contrary on the internet with nothing more than a Google search. So unless they live completely out in the wilderness and have no internet access, they would know better than what they are telling their public congregations and audiences. The students might have no choice but to simply repeat what they have been told in class, because they have to answer to their teachers for their grades. And the producers of the video you just saw were not scientists. They were simply art students producing a video for the state of Florida. But those officials in the government of the state of Florida know what they have promoted is pure disinformation. And not only that, it is also dangerously deceptive on multiple levels. Not only historically and scientifically, but morally, medically, and even theologically. Especially theologically, which is our primary interest in this topic. First off, concerning the claim by counter-reformationists, there is no Antichrist in the earth today, which is obviously not addressed in the video. That is 100% hogwash, and is completely anti-biblical. In the voluminous and various different series of videos on this channel, it has already been made completely clear the Antichrist has come a long time ago and is still present in the earth, as was known prior to the Great Delusion conducted in evangelical Christianity by counter-reformationists. It was attested to unanimously by the founders and doctrinal confessions of every branch of historic denominational Protestant Christianity in existence, and continued for half a millennia. The propagation of counter-Reformation eschatology, and a coordinated campaign of political, social and economic persecution, was used to brainwash that awareness in American Christians into extinction. Secondly, back to the video, the insinuation that because something was mentioned in the 16th century, it has always been here, is a complete lie. Comparing red tide in the 16th century to what is happening now is like claiming the lunar landing was nothing new, because rocket travel was said to have been known in China in 2000 BC. So therefore, it's been around since 2000 BC. And furthermore, the reference even in the 16th century was mentioned in the 16th century for a very profound theological and synchronistic reason, which they are never going to tell the public either. It wasn't just a casual reference. But also, it is completely false that because it was mentioned in the 16th century, it has therefore always been present, as it is now. It has not. That is proven false by the historical timeline itself. Thirdly, everything that happens in the ocean, or the sky, or medically, is natural, because it exists in nature. So claiming it is natural, is very misleading. If it exists in nature, then it is natural. That term used this way, is completely meaningless. Of course it's natural. It happens in nature, as everything does. You can also say, that if you curse God, and are suddenly struck by lightning, it is also, quote, completely natural. Or, if you lie against the Holy Spirit, and suddenly fall over dead from a heart attack, that too is completely natural. And you have died of, quote, natural causes. Even if it is, clearly, also, the judgment of God. And if you are perceived to be clinically dead, with no pulse and no breath, and you resurrect in 3 days, that is also called completely natural. As it has actually even happened in modern, clinical near-death cases. So if everything is natural, as it is commonly used, then there is no point in even using the term. Describing it as natural is the same thing as calling everything by the nonsensical term, like boingy bong. And making the statement, quote, it must be understood that red tide is completely boingy bong. End quote. It has no meaning. But, if you mean by the word natural, that there was no human cause, and no human blame, and no human accountability, then that would amount to pure propaganda. There is very clear and disputable and undeniable evidence, what they are calling just part of the natural ecosystem, is being created by human behavior. Unless you think it is completely natural, and just part of the ecosystem, to pump thousands of tons of sewage into the ocean, on a daily basis. And, in spite of claiming on the video, it is completely natural, and not related to human behavior, they also pointed out, that in order for a bloom to grow, to any proportion that would pose a problem, it must have nutrients in the water, and exacerbate the overpopulation of the algae, and the modern incarnation of this natural phenomena, is found to be, directly connected to what humans, are putting into that water. And that was even admitted in the video itself, demonstrating, the claim of the video, was blatantly contradictory. On the one hand, they claim, red tide has nothing to do with humans. But on the other hand, claim, red tide blooms, are provided nutrients from human sewage. So, which is it? And fourthly, the claim that this is unique to the Gulf of Mexico, is a complete lie. The specific species of algae, known as Carenia brevis, is not unique to the Gulf of Mexico, it is found all over the world, and more importantly, that is not the only species of algae, on Earth, in the world, that produces red tide. That was the other fact, they conveniently never mentioned. So let's get started, finding out the unvarnished, uncensored truth, about red tide, which is the second and third saucer judgment. And find out, what all the counter-reformationist, habitual liars, have intentionally hidden, from the public. Quote, red tide is a natural event that occurs nearly every year. End quote. As you can guess, the primary goal of a deceiver is to tell a lie. And if you have been told, red tide is a natural event that occurs nearly every year, you can count on the fact, that is told to hide the truth. So it is either that it does not happen nearly every year, or, that it is not natural. By natural, meaning, it is a completely spontaneous occurrence, that has nothing to do with man. Does it happen nearly every year, and is it a completely natural phenomena, or just part of the ecosystem? Unfortunately, for the citizens of the state of Florida, both claims are false. It does not happen nearly every year, and it is not a natural occurrence, that is just part of the ecosystem. First, let's discuss the claim, red tide is a natural phenomena that has nothing to do with human development. What is happening has everything to do with human development, and how it is managed, for money. It is natural, only in the sense that red tide is the natural consequence of continually disobeying God, for filthy lucre. Serving mammon. The motivation of idolatry. All in obedience to the Antichrist. It is specifically linked to the treatment that has been unjustly given to God's prophetic messengers and His holy people, who would not compromise for filthy gain. That is the theological truth of why it is happening. But to find the scientific truth of how it is happening would not be to consult the very compromised state of Florida's current government, unless you were one of those ministers who are primarily motivated by money. That all the apostles, unequivocally and unapologetically, openly damned to hell, in the New Testament. The first lie is that the algae, Karenia brevis, is unique to the Gulf of Mexico. In Science Digest, in the article entitled, Safety Assessment Including Current and Emerging Issues in Toxicology Pathology, the article states, quote, brevetoxins are produced primarily by marine dinoflagellates belonging to the genus Karenia. The species is found worldwide, with toxic blooms of Karenia brevis, formerly known as Gymnodium breventicodiscus brevis, being the organism most recently associated with red tides in the Gulf of Mexico. End quote. This algae is found all over the world, not just around Florida, and not just in the Gulf of Mexico. That fact is repeated again in the U.S. National Office for Harmful Algal Blooms. It is said to be globally distributed. And when you click on the species involved in harmful algae blooms, specifically by name, 4 names pop up. The first is Alexandrium. The second is Gambierdiscus. The third is Karenia. And the fourth is Pseudonychia. They all cause various versions of red tide, including also the other colors of brown and green. They are all either harmful or deadly to marine, mammalian and human life. Now that we have straightened that talking point out, back to a true north, then the question becomes, if it is actually present all over the world, why does it grow, particularly and especially, around Florida? And, why did red tide historically begin in Florida? Back in the 16th century? First, let's discover the cause that no one wants to talk about, which is not simply the ecosystem of the Gulf. In order to do that, we will have to have an objective and true account, from science, of what is actually happening, on a microscopic level. The webpage on red tide, from the Smithsonian Museum of Natural History, explains that when the algae in the ocean is, quote, supplied with excess nutrients, they can multiply uncontrollably, becoming an unwanted mass, commonly called red tide, that smothers the nearby ocean. The article continues, quote, when nutrients from inland areas flow down rivers and arrive in the ocean, they supply a nutritious feast for algae. This can occur naturally as rivers flood and bring nutrient-rich soil from forests and grasslands, but it can also happen when fertilizer and excrement from livestock travel down those same waterways, or when coastal development leads to erosion. Some algae species, like the dinoflagellate, Karenia brevis, colored the ocean's surface a deep red, inspiring the name, red tide. End quote. So, the Smithsonian explains, there are 2 ways the algae can get excess nutrients. The first is naturally, as a result of rivers and grassland flooding, and thus creating storm runoff from the soil-rich water. But the second way is the result of human development, in which case, the storm runoff can carry human feces, animal excrement and fertilizers, which all serve to cause an algae bloom, smothering the ocean. In paragraph 4, the Smithsonian explains, quote, often, the presence of a red tide is most visible due to its effect on the rest of the ecosystem. These toxins are harmful to marine mammals, birds and turtles. Karenia brevis produces a neurotoxin called brevetoxin that disrupts the firing of nerve cells. End quote. the higher doses of the neurotoxin, brevetoxin, has been linked to human deaths. That is why, beaches wanting to avoid a lawsuit, will routinely post public signs that beaches will be closed, is now required by law. And because red tide is now happening year-round, continuously, in some part of the state, there is a forecast site provided by the state that announces which beaches are closed to the public, and where fishing and shellfish harvesting are now illegal. But these sites will generally not be advertised to the public. Because who wants to see a map of Florida patched in red tides? In paragraph 5, the Smithsonian states, quote, "Off the coast of California, an algae called Pseudonitskia produces another neurotoxin that has a similar effect on sea lions, cormorants and pelicans." End quote. So, red tide is not exclusive to the Gulf Coast, either. In paragraph 6, the article continues, quote, "It can also cause illness to swimmers. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration estimates toxic algal blooms, which include red tides, account for the annual loss of roughly $82 million." End quote. Over 10 years, that accumulates to $82 billion that taxpayers have to fix, solve, or owe on a state and federal level. And that is only with the current losses, not the ones that will inevitably be increased by population expansion over time. In paragraph 7, the Smithsonian explains the occurrence of dead zones. Quote, "Not only do red tides create toxic oceans, they can also deplete the water of dissolved oxygen, causing a phenomenon known as a dead zone. When the ocean becomes depleted of oxygen, fish can die en masse, leaving the ocean surface covered in floating, dead fish, for as far as the eye can see." End quote. The consequences of red tide to the oceans are literally and truly apocalyptic. And what is feeding this disaster is largely man-made, due to state mismanagement of natural resources, because of the greater-than-life interest of money. If money is more important to you than life, then all you have to do is be paid to kill yourself. And that is precisely what we are now doing. So, as you can see, the unnatural occurrence of red tide is fed by sewage and storm drain runoff, which carries with it everything that happens to be on the flooded ground that it sweeps into the ocean due to drain pipes from development. Cow manure, dog feces, human feces from sewage overflows into flooded waters, and fertilizer. So, the question is, does this occur and is it the source of the unnatural increase in red tide? That answer is an astounding and shocking yes. Here are photos of Florida's red tide that is claimed to be an all-natural phenomena in the Gulf of Mexico. Here is a Natural Geographic article that discusses Florida's 2018 red tide, which was described as the worst outbreak in over a decade, and it is entitled, "Red Tide is Devastating Florida's Sea Life. Are Humans to Blame?" The article states, quote, "It is a wildlife massacre of massive proportions. It's like a ghost town," says Heather Barron, head veterinarian at Florida's Clinic for the Rehabilitation of Wildlife. "Anything that can leave, has left, and anything that didn't, died." End quote. As you look at the photos of Florida's red tide, and you ponder whether or not this is really natural, and you remember that according to the Smithsonian website on oceans and red tide, it explained that the second way, Karenia brevis, algae, get excess nutrients, is through the mismanagement of human development and its impact on the ocean, you might want to know what they didn't tell you. Citizens made the local news, requesting that Naples, Florida, remove its storm drain into the ocean, which empties out directly onto the city beach. Their complaint is that it pollutes the beach area where people are swimming with all sorts of unwanted guests, from animal excrement to chemical fertilizers, which not only provide algae blooms excess nutrients, but are also dangerous to humans. And if you think that is crazy to put a drain pipe right on the beach, you should also know this about Florida. In every coastal town and city, no matter how small or large it is, there are drain pipes that channel storm sewage straight into the ocean from every corner of the state. That's what is feeding these algae blooms. But that's not all. As you look at these photos of red tide, here is what was lurking under the surface of that ocean water. divers took underwater photographs to show the public. These are sewage pipes. There are billions of gallons of sewage water being released on the ocean floor. You remember how the video you watched cited how the blooms originated miles offshore from the coast. So it couldn't possibly be caused by human development. Well, what they never bothered to tell anyone was that the sewage pipes have to be a minimum of 4 miles away from shore, so the pipes will not float sewage onto the beach. But instead, they float Karenia brevis, algae blooms, or what is commonly known as red tide. With the thermohaline currents present on the ocean floor, it only takes 15 hours for that watery sludge to reach the 10-mile mark, precisely where Karenia brevis blooms are said to be observed as having most originated in the video you just saw. This chart shows a comparison of red tide from 1954 to 1963 and then compared to the chart of red tide from 1994 to 2002. And the article is entitled, "Red Tide is Not Naturally Occurring." These statistics demonstrate red tide today is not the occasional fluke red tide of the past that it once was. It is dramatically changing in modern times, and it is changing quickly. In the previous section, we discovered that the commonly repeated talking points about red tide are disinformation, and there are a multitude of motivations for them. But as you have also discovered, a faithful rendition of Revelation chapter 16, verse 3, from the Textus Receptus, describes red tide as the second and third bowl or saucer, judgments. And we have since discovered that it is all over the world. Its occurrence and severity is directly related to man-made causes. And it is produced by 4 different types of algae that all are harmful to aquatic life, and birds, and even humans. And that produce the bizarre phenomena of ocean water looking like blood, known as red tide. On the website, entitled Microbial Life Educational Resources, from Montana State University, the website states, quote, "Countries affected by red tide events include Argentina, Australia, Brazil, Canada, Chile, Denmark, England, France, Guatemala, Hong Kong, India, Ireland, Italy, Japan, the Netherlands, New Zealand, Norway, New Guinea, Peru, the Philippines, Romania, Russia, Scotland, Spain, Sweden, Thailand, the United States, and Venezuela." End quote. This list, however, is actually decades old, dating all the way back to 2007 and 2012. But red tide now include many more countries than are listed on this list, including now Iceland, Uruguay, China, and many others, which you will see demonstrated the phenomena has spread to the rest of the world. UNESCO is an acronym which stands for the UN's Organization for Educational, Scientific and Cultural Cooperation. The organization was founded after World War II, on November 16, 1945. Its headquarters are located in Paris, France, and the UN organization has 190 members from all over the world that collaborate in science and education. The UN organization has been studying the effect of climate change on harmful algae blooms, otherwise known as red tide. The following is a global map, tracking only one kind of algae all over the world, which is the Pseudonitschia variant. As you see from the map, it has a global presence. The map is shaded from dark purple to green and yellow, indicating the presence of blooms. When you look up close and spot the greens and yellows, you can see the number of harmful algae blooms that have happened all over the world since the 1950s. And at the bottom, you can see the trend line of how the phenomena has progressed over time in a global way. It is now virtually everywhere in the world, affecting every major landmass continent on Earth. Tracking only the Pseudonitschia variety. The following is a scientific article on red tide blooms in Japan. The article states, quote, "From 1900 to 1950, the number of reports on red tide was about 10 to 25 per decade, and after 1950, it gradually increased." End quote. The article goes on to note, however, quote, "In the 1970s, the number jumped dramatically to more than 200 cases per year." End quote. His sentence goes on to correlate the locations of the blooms. Historically, to the development heavy industry in these same coastal areas. And then, at the bottom, the writer concludes with, quote, "After 1970, effort and large budgets were devoted to the elucidation of the biology and ecology of red tide organisms, and their blooming mechanisms, modeling and mitigation methods." End quote. The adjacent maps show the progression of red tide blooms in Japan from 1978 to present. And you can see the dramatic increase in frequency after 1970. So red tide goes all the way to the other side of the world. When you hear that it only happens in Florida, that is a lie told by people who do not want you to know something has happened in the earth, called global warming, which is also the fourth saucer judgment. And only happens because the Antichrist is demonstrably here, with prophetic signs of confirmation. This article is also a science article, given in a presentation on the effect of global warming and red tides in China. Professor Zhu reported that red tides were first documented in the 1930s. But since 1990, there has been a drastic increase in red tides, to the extent that between the years 1990 and 2019, 1,557 red tides were documented as having occurred. The adjacent maps to the left map out the distribution of these outbreaks in China from 1990 to 2019. The following is a statistical chart from research.net on the occurrence of red tide organism blooms in the Persian Gulf from the year 1987 to the year 2017. As you can see, the Persian Gulf has gone from a virtually negligible number to over 20 red tide events per year. The next chart shows the number of documented red tide events in the Mediterranean Sea, documented by publication articles between the years 2002 to 2020. As you can see, this went from just 3 publications on red tide events in 2002 to over 30 in 2020, which is a tenfold increase in 18 years. The next article on scientific statistics from ResearchGate plot the global increase in harmful algae bloom red tide events from the year 1910 to the year 2010, covering the statistical history of an entire century. As you can see from the chart, the claim that red tide is a natural oceanic phenomena is patently absurd. The next chart is from the website of nature.com, tracking the numbers of humans eating contaminated shellfish from red tide organisms as a result of red tide outbreaks. The site showed the maps tracking 3 variants of algae, which produce neurotoxins, resulting in emergency medical treatment. On the right in the maps, you can see these events occurred all over the world. In the column on the right in red, you can see how the number of events themselves increased in frequency from 1980 to 2020. As you can see from the science, the claim red tide has always been around, so there is nothing to it, is either a form of complete ignorance, or it is laughable propaganda. But that's not the only problem. The third saucer judgment is extension of this plague to freshwater sources in the form of rivers and lakes. And the third saucer plague poses an even greater danger to human beings than the second saucer judgment, which is now found multiplying exponentially in both frequency and severity all over the world. And that brings us to the third saucer judgment, which is the prophecy that this plague will be extended to freshwater sources. And there is an additional, and potentially much more serious problem presented for society, beyond the killing of aquatic marine life. After the announcement of the third saucer judgment, John states in verse 6, that because they have spilled the blood of the prophets in the Kadesh, he will give them blood to drink. Thus indicating the drinking water sources will also be affected in the third saucer judgment. Freshwater HABs, once again, short for harmful algae blooms, also produce red tide appearances, as you can see in these CDC photos. Cyanobacteria contaminated water. Cyanobacteria blooms can present as red, green or brown. The more frequent color is however blue-green, hence the name cyanobacteria, which is the Greek word for blue, as in the blue-green color of the algae. You don't normally think of green as the color of blood, but actually, there is some amazing coincidences present in the reference of fresh water as blood, and the striking green color of its cyanobacteria blooms. Blood does actually turn green. The mechanism that produces green blood is medically, commonly known as pus. Pus is not the infection itself, as most people often think. Pus is created by the autoimmune system, in the blood itself, in order to actually fight the infection. The green color, known as pus, is actually produced by the blood, because as you see in the article in Medical News Today, the blood system creates macrophages and neutrophils in the blood itself to combat the infection. The green is not the infection, it is the blood's attempt to fight the infection as a result of the immune system. So, in other words, the blood turns green. There is even a blood disorder that causes the blood to turn green, that even shares the same Greek name described in medical science. And that is the occurrence of something known as cyanosis, which shares its prefix with the other term, cyanobacteria. Cyanobacteria, in lakes and rivers, produces all the same effects as red tide in the ocean, including even on occasion, the red and crimson colors, and the other symptoms, such as fish kills, the production of neurotoxins, and the oxygen depletion of the water, and it associated dead zones for all aquatic life. The following is a map produced by the Environmental Working Group, which shows all the cyanobacterial harmful algae blooms from 2010 to the present. As you can see, this is a huge widespread problem all over the United States. The United States Environmental Protection Agency uses satellites to monitor these drinking sources from space. This is a map of cyanobacterial blooms in the United States for the 2021 fiscal year from space. And as you can see, its map is far more extensive than the one produced by the Environmental Working Group. But there is a much bigger problem for human societies in freshwater blooms. Most of the societies depend on the same lakes and rivers that contain freshwater red tides in the form of cyanobacteria blooms for drinking. And the neurotoxins produced by the algae blooms, when the algae decomposes, can remain in the drinking water after the blooms have gone. The United States Environmental Protection Agency defines the term microcystin as, quote, "Microcystin is a potent liver toxin and possible human carcinogen. Cyanotoxins can also kill livestock and pets that drink affected waters. Fish and bird mortalities have also been reported in water bodies with persistent cyanobacteria blooms." End quote. This is a map produced by the United States Geological Survey, showing the levels of microcystin toxin concentration in drinking water sources across America, ranging from low concentration to medium concentration to high concentration. Us EPA scientists have discovered, if the level of microcystin toxins exceed a certain level, then the water will not be safe to drink until additional filtration or purification measures can be taken. The source has to be taken offline. In other words, there is a certain threshold of concentration of microcystin toxins that would render the source dangerous to the public. The map shows 7 sites with high concentrations and 5 sites with moderate concentrations of microcystin toxins. And as with the second saucer judgment, all the same problems exist with cyanobacterial algae blooms being fed by the runoff into the rivers and lakes, carrying industrial chemicals, animal excrement and fertilizer to either produce or exacerbate these man-made disaster algae blooms. And without a doubt, they are man-made disasters caused by mismanagement policies driven by placing profits over both the truth and life itself. In the next section, we will examine when the age of the second and third saucer judgment began, and its fulfillment in history. The often repeated claim that counter-Reformation propagandists have repeated, that red tide and freshwater toxic algae bloom has been around since the dawn of time, and their occurrence means nothing, will be shown to be another lie, told because of either ignorance about it, or simply another bold-faced lie, in order to deceive the public. But in either case, it is a known lie, easily realized, with just a minimal effort, to find out the truth. So it is hard to believe that any of these preachers would really be that completely ignorant. If you are going to get up in a public pulpit and have a bunch of dogmatic opinions about something, the very least you could possibly do on the subject is conduct a simple Google search and read what you actually find. Otherwise, you are guilty of a dereliction of duty, akin to gross negligence. We are going to show you two well-documented, reputable sources of historical timelines. The first will come from a PDF published by the Herald Tribune newspaper of Sarasota, Florida. Its parent company, at the time of its compilation, was the New York Times. The second timeline will come from the National Library of Medicine, of the spread of Carina brevis type, red tide, to other countries for the first documented time in history. It will confirm that the information of what has happened locally, in Florida, is also true of the rest of the world. The first is a PDF, which is a rather extensive historical timeline of red tide events, published July 16, 2006, by the Herald Tribune. The earlier PDF is no longer available, but there is instead a web page where the same information can be found. Links to both the Library of Medicine article and the Herald Tribune Red Tide Timeline webpage will be listed below in the description section of this video. What is unique about this timeline is that it reports known and documented historical firsts in the timeline of Florida's red tide phenomena. When there is an historical first, it means that what happened in that event had never been known to have happened before, previously, in history. Someone may claim something happened before, but there is no witness of it, no source of its observation, and no record of its existence in history. Meaning, the claim cannot be substantiated. It is merely a rumor, or a speculation. These events are historical firsts, and they are fully documented, and constitute the historical first time it occurred, along with the year of its occurrence. The PDF focuses not only on the historical firsts, but includes the scientific first concerning red tide as well, and even the timeline of red tide, denial of the link between human behavior and its occurrence, and how that was, historically, shown to be wrong. But we will just show the historical timeline of actual red tide events, because that is our focus. While the Herald Tribune PDF is in the form of a grocery list of events, we took the historical events of this timeline and placed them onto a graphical timeline, so you could actually visualize what the dates of these events will show. 16th century, a Spanish explorer records stories by Florida Indians of toxic red water and the resulting death of birds and fish. 1844, the first scientifically documented red tide episode in U.S. waters occurs in the Gulf, along what is called the West Florida Shelf, off the Panhandle, near Panama City. 1878, Florida's first protracted period of red tide episodes begin and continues for 10 years. 1880, a widespread episode of bird mortality affects the Florida Gulf. It is believed by some to have resulted from red tide. 1884, the first incident of human sickness from red tide infected shellfish is recorded in Florida. 1947, after record rains in the Panhandle, a massive red tide bloom along the Florida Gulf Coast lasts nearly a year, all but destroying the commercial fishing industry and killing the sponge beds near Tarpon Springs. All along the coast, Time magazine reported, quote, "The spray of the poisoned surf inflamed human throats and lungs. Tourists deserted the hotels. Schools were closed. Beach areas evacuated." End quote. Among the communities affected was Venice, site of the first documented evidence of red tide on the lower Gulf Coast. 1953, the longest single red tide episode recorded to the date, begins an 18-month stay along the Florida Gulf Coast. 1994, a 2-year red tide bloom begins, eclipsing the 40-year record for sustained episodes. 1996, after a brief respite, red tide returns to the Gulf again in January, and within a month, extends from Pinellas County nearly to Key West. Red tide is blamed for the deaths of 238 manatees, 10% of the total population. 1998, first year of the unbroken run of annual red tide episodes that continues to this day. 2001, the Apalachicola Oyster Festival imports oysters after the bay is closed to shellfishing because of red tide. 2002, an April bloom closes shellfishing along the Gulf and fouls beaches from Naples to Nokomis. The bloom contributes to a 60-mile patch of black water, visible by satellite. 2003, 3 dogs on Little Gasparilla Island are diagnosed with red tide poisoning, the first time such infection is seen in dogs outside the lab. 2005, a red tide bloom lasting most of the year, results in a dead zone, the size of Rhode Island, on the Gulf floor. Sarasota County health officials propose posting red tide alert signs on area beaches, but tourism officials warn that they could have an adverse effect. 2006, after a brief respite, red tide picks up again, causing state scientists to call the bloom that began in 2005 one of the 2 or 3 worst in Florida's history. The National Sierra Club says it will open a Sarasota office to move red tide to the top of the agenda. As you can see from the historical timeline, it is a false claim that red tide has always been here. And it is not just an annual event, that is a normal part of the ecosystem, and it is exclusive to the Gulf of Mexico. But, in reality, and in fact, absolutely nothing could be any farther from the truth. These sources and people are simply knowingly lying about what is really happening. The next is a grocery list of historic firsts for 14 countries in the world, all experiencing red tide bloom from Karenia brevis algae, or one of its close variants, in the Karenia brevis family, such as the Gyrodinium aureolum algae. This is not all the countries that have experienced red tide, but just the countries that have experienced red tide, from just the Karenia genus algae. It is also a grocery list of documented historical firsts, worldwide, of this oceanic phenomena. And likewise, as before, we will also plot this list on a graphical timeline to show you what those dates illustrate. The first column will give the specific variant of Karenia algae that will be discovered in the red tide, then the chart will show the year, and then what country was affected. Karenia brevis 1844 West Florida Shelf. Karenia Mikimoto 1893 Toba, Ayas Bay, Japan. Karenia brevis 1935 South Texas Shelf. Karenia Mikimoto 1998 Hong Kong. Karenia digitata 2000 Hong Kong. Karenia longicaunalis 2001 Hong Kong. Gyrodinium aureolum 1966 Southern Norway. Gyrodinium aureolum 1968 Western Denmark. Gyrodinium aureolum 1971 Eastern Irish Sea. Gyrodinium aureolum 1976 Southern Ireland. Gyrodinium aureolum 1978 Western France. Gyrodinium aureolum 1981 Southern Brazil. Gyrodinium aureolum 1988 Northern Argentina. Karenia spp. 1999 Southern Chile Shelf. Gyrodinium aureolum 1991 Tunisia. Karenia celiformis 1999 Kuwait. Karenia bicuniformis 2003 Gordons Bay, South Africa. Karenia cristata 2003 Walker Bay, South Africa. Gyrodinium aureolum 1987 Iraqi Gulf East Auckland. Karenia Mikimoto 1992 Iraqi Gulf East Auckland. Karenia brevis ocata 2000 Wellington Harbour East Auckland. Karenia Concordia 2004 Iraqi Gulf East Auckland. Karenia papilionacea 2004 New Zealand East Auckland. Karenia astrichroma 2004 Tasmania East Australia. Karenia umbella 2004 Tasmania East Australia. Karenia umbella 2004 Western Australia. The previous chart is only tracing the occurrence of Karenia algae variants. But there are 3 other species of red tide producing algae, each with their own variants, in the ocean, worldwide. As you can see from the plot of years on the historical timeline, according to the National Library of Medicine, this oceanic phenomena started with the state of Florida, in the southeastern United States, in 1844, and has progressively made its way through the entire Earth. When we analyze this spread to major industrialized nations, for the very first time in history, you will see the occurrences of red tide outbreaks occur in 3 distinct waves of divine retribution, or what is known colloquially as the judgment of God against the nations of the earth. Additionally, in our graph, if you look on the chart, you will see what historical events this saucer judgment was a precursor to. The synchronicity of the red tide events and their occurrence in history has a direct correlation with what is about to happen in the annals of history in these countries. So the story of what is producing this oceanic phenomena goes much deeper than what the public is ever told. And we will see that next. What and why red tide? Quote, Florida banned state workers from using term climate change report. Officials with the Florida Department of Environmental Protection, the agency in charge of setting conservation policy and enforcing environmental laws in the state, issued directives in 2011 barring thousands of employees from using the phrases climate change and global warming, according to a bombshell report by the Florida Center for Investigative Reporting. The instruction not to refer to climate change came from agency supervisors as well as lawyers, according to the report. We were told not to use the terms climate change, global warming or sustainability. The report quotes Christopher Bird, who was an attorney with the DEP's Office of General Counsel in Tallahassee from 2008 to 2013, as saying, "That message was communicated to me and my colleagues by our superiors in the Office of General Counsel. We were instructed by our regional administrator that we were no longer allowed to use the terms global warming or climate change or even sea level rise," said a second former DEP employee, Christina Trotta. Sea level rise was to be referred to as nuisance flooding. According to the employee's accounts, the ban left damaging holes in everything from educational material published by the agency, to training programs, to annual reports on the environment, that could be used to set energy and business policy. The 2014 National Climate Assessment for the U.S. found an imminent threat of increased inland flooding in Florida due to climate change and called the state uniquely vulnerable to sea level rise. End quote. As you can see, there are a lot of liars willing to put the lives, property and businesses of millions of people at risk for absolutely nothing. They love the policy so much, in Florida, they re-elected him. Until they got hit by the next 9 hurricanes, and the ever-continuing statewide apocalyptic red tides. So let's find out why these political and theological lies of omission and disinformation are so dangerous and costly. Why is red tide increasing in frequency and severity? There is undeniable scientific evidence that red tide is increasing in both frequency and severity in many parts of the world. One reason for this is the increasing levels of nutrients in the water due to human activities, such as urbanization, agriculture, and the discharge of sewage and other pollutants. As human populations grow and expand into coastal areas, the amount of nutrients entering these waters can increase dramatically. Another factor is climate change, which can alter ocean temperature and currents, leading to changes in the distribution and abundance of the species of algae that cause red tides. Warmer water temperatures can also promote the growth and spread of harmful algal blooms. Additionally, extreme weather events, such as hurricanes and floods, can transport nutrients and other pollutants into coastal waters, exacerbating the problem. Finally, there is also evidence that the global transport of harmful algal species is increasing, possibly due to increased shipping and other human activities. As these species are transported to new regions, they can establish themselves and cause red tides in areas where they were previously unknown. Barnacles are small aquatic shellfish that are attached to the hulls of virtually all ocean-going vessels. And as we have already seen, shellfish store Karenia brevis algae in their shells, and that is why you cannot eat shellfish when they are contaminated by red tide water. So red tide algae can literally be transported from Florida ports and spread all over the world, and they can even produce variants of Karenia genus algae from the same exact family genus that is specifically adapted to the conditions of the local ocean, wherever that might be. Another aspect to the red tide mystery lies in the occurrence of the fourth saucer judgment, which is the prophecy about the increased temperature of the Earth, which we will cover in the next video. As the surface temperature increases over time, there is a geological phenomenon known as desertification. What is desertification, and what does that have to do with red tides in the ocean? It turns out that there is a domino effect taking place in our atmosphere as a result of global warming. And it has a lot to do with the production of red tide algae blooms, referred to in the Greek of the text as receptus, as blood-like waters. But like everything to do with red tide, desertification itself is not a purely natural phenomena due to global warming. At least not the kind of desertification we are witnessing today. Global warming is acting as the catalyst that is highlighting our source of evil, with mismanagement, for mainly monetary concern. The following article on desertification identifies 4 causes that are human behavior and not natural causes. 1 is deforestation. 2 is poor agricultural practices. 3 is overexploitation of natural resources, namely water usage. And 4 is bad livestock practices. The previous president, in Brazil, would be a good example of deforestation and desertification. Quote, between August 1, 2019, and July 31, 2021, a period that largely overlaps with Bolsonaro's first 3 years in office, more than 34,000 square kilometers, 8.4 million acres, actually disappeared from the Amazon rainforest. End quote. Bolsonaro actually decided to go on a slash and burn crusade against the Amazon rainforest, telling his voters the lie, everyone was just wanting to make them poor, so you can cut it all up for timber and get rich. The people of Brazil didn't find out he had actually lied until he refused to leave office after his election loss. Like the previous US president, he was taking his political lessons from. And so, then, of course, he became an immigrant and moved to Florida. In the article from Science Advances, it was discovered the less rain the deserts receive every year because of global warming, the more each desert will produce dust clouds. And because of convection winds, this dust is whipped up at the surface and carried high into the atmosphere, where they can be blown all over the world for thousands of miles. And as you see in the picture, in the right-hand corner, there is a dust cloud blowing over from the Sahara Desert, which is one of the largest deserts on planet Earth. In the chart, which you saw, from the Library of Medicine, the purpose of that chart was to present the findings of a study on the link between the process of desertification caused by global warming and the dust clouds produced by these deserts. Each Karenia genus type algae, found in those 14 countries, also were found to correlate to the quantity of dust blowing into the areas from deserts around the world. He lists the source of desert dust in the last column of each red tide bloom in the chart. This is a screen capture of the map he produced for the study. As you can see, he marks the source of the desert dust cloud for each country. The following is a timeline chart of the historical firsts of red tide from the Herald Tribune article. As you can clearly see, it is exponentially increasing in frequency and severity. That is simply an observation of reality. But now we come to the theological question of, why on earth is God doing this? If you look at the same timeline and chart the major sociological and historical developments in the evolution of Christmas, this is what you see. But when you overlap the dates of the evolution of Christmas in America with the dates of red tides in America, this is what you will see. And remember, from what you have heard and seen with your own eyes, the Christmas Christ is known from the Bible as Apollyon, otherwise known by Masons as aka Lucifer. You will understand if what is being worshipped in Christmas is really Lucifer and not Christ, and it is, then you will understand how and why God is responding with a full show from heaven and in history to the ongoing deception of the Antichrist. And also why so many people actually want to hide it. It is at the same time that the Spanish conquistador, Cabez de Vaca, brought Christmas to Florida that he was greeted by Timucua Indians, retelling their stories of aguas rojas, or red waters, that had preceded his soon arrival. And although this instance of aguas rojas, or red tide, was obviously natural, it was also not without synchronicity, as an immense sign about the coming of this European, which could not have been possibly missed by local Indians who were now themselves the victim of bloodshed over wild rumors of the gold they had in their modest possession. Valid Catholicism refers to the Jesuit-produced theology that sponsored the very first slave plantation and the earliest slavery trade in America, sold in the southern states to plantation owners, which justified slavery on the basis that the Africans and Indians were subhuman and mentioned in the Old Testament term of the beasts of the field, That is why it was fitting to own them as cattle, rather than treat them as human equals. This theology was debated in the city of Valladolid, Spain, where missionaries complained, if they were really beasts, then it would dispense of their obligation to convert to Catholicism and give tithes to the priests and missionaries. So in essence, the Jesuit slave traders were putting the religion business of the church out of business by claiming they were non-humans. In the West Indies, the Indians had been reduced to animals, in which their skin and bones were being used to make furniture and clothing. So that was why there was the Valladolid debates, but it was from the city of Valladolid, Spain, that the original Ku Klux Klan adopted the distinctive caparot hoods, demonstrating their agreement with the Catholic theology of the original Jesuit slave traders, including its observance of Christmas. No matter what had happened in the Reformation and all its subsequent theological developments, Valladolid Catholics were distinctively counter-Reformationists. Even though they could claim to be either Protestant or Catholic, they were counter-Reformationists, and thus the theological designation, Valladolid Catholic, from where the theology originally evolved. In essence, they were really just followers of the Antichrist. When Jefferson Davis announced himself as President of the Confederacy, he wrote to none other than the papacy in Rome for recognition. And the papacy actually wrote him back with warm greetings for attempting to destroy the Protestant United States by dissolution. The assassins of President Lincoln were all devout Catholic zealots on the side of the Confederacy. As the timeline moves forward, despite storms and floods and even hurricanes striking the Florida shores, not a drop of the Aguas Rojas, red tides, which preceded the Conquistador, to Vaca, until 1844. And what happens prior to 1844? In 1836, the slave state of Alabama, previously known as the, quote, heart of Dixie, filled to its borders with Valladolid Catholicism, makes Christmas an official state holiday, governing all its fiduciary operations. Within 1 year, an Alabama regiment of volunteers and U.S. soldiers intrude into Florida for the sole purpose of constructing a military fort called Christmas, Florida. But it should have been named Alabama, Florida. And within just 2 years of that date, plantation owners are reported actually giving slaves to each other as their Christmas presents. And just 1 year before the first time in history that red tide is ever actually seen by Floridians, Charles Dickens publishes his book, known as A Christmas Carol, which is credited for recruiting the remaining slave-owning southern plantation states into following the lead of Alabama. And God's response was red tide. Possibly from divine justice itself, as fate would have it, the production of a Saharan dust cloud might have even back then descended down from heaven, from the same continent and western shores that those former slaves of history had been captured and sold, who had been given as Christmas gifts in the same slave state of Alabama. In fact, so synchronistic was the event that God himself gave Alabama a name they would never forget as long as they lived on the earth. He had them name the University of Alabama's football team the Crimson Tide, right out of the pages of Revelation 16. They literally, and most certainly, accidentally, named their most prized cultural possession in the state of Alabama, after the second saucer judgment, described in Revelation 16. And quite unintentionally, now they live with the knowledge, whether conscious or unconscious, of what they have done in history. And God's prophetic response, in the form of the second saucer judgment. When anyone thinks of Alabama, they cannot help but think of the Crimson Tide. When you move forward in time to the history of the second wave of red tide outbreaks, you see three of the most culturally important developments in the evolution of Christmas, or as it actually is, Lucifer worship. Or, just, Christian devil worship, if you prefer. First in 1870, President Ulysses Grant, who was a counter-Reformationist German Lutheran, makes Christmas a federal holiday, despite the prohibition against it in the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. The second evolutionary development is the invention of Christmas tree lights in 1882. which has actually been the source of thousands of house fires spanning over its history, including even today, leading to destruction of whole homes, burns and even the deaths of children. And the third was the 1897 publication by the Sun newspaper, Yes, Virginia, There is a Santa Claus, which of course, there is not. The sweet little Virginia O'Hanlon went on to become a celibate Jesuit missionary operative in the U.S. public school system, promoting religious compulsion policy under the guise of Santa Claus, during the rise of Nazism and Father Charles Coughlin, in America. The third wave of red tide begins with President Woodrow Wilson, who is a Southern Presbyterian, and whose term begins in 1913. Despite all the pandering and spin-doctoring authors do to gloss him over, he hosted a premiere of D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation in the White House, and praised the Ku Klux Klan as a savior metaphor for the Southern white male. Wilson's deep-rooted valid Catholic theology of white supremacy, or racism, and Christmas, which actually go inseparably together, prompted him to be the first president in U.S. history to ignore the limitations of the separation of church and state, or care about the Protestant taxpayers, and demand a national Christmas tree. By the end of his term, in 1921, he had inspired not only a whole nation toward the second organization of the Ku Klux Klan, complete with millions of members and parades down the streets of Washington, D.C., but also the infamous Tulsa Massacre in 1921, where 35 entire city blocks of the city of Tulsa was torched to the ground for a revenge killing by racial terrorists, inspired by Woodrow Wilson's valid Catholic Ku Klux Klan. The number of people killed in the violence, though massive, is not even clearly known to this day. 6,000 of Tulsa's African American community were forcefully interned on the fairgrounds. And, aside from the number of deaths they inflicted, which may have been as many as 300 men, women, and children, their homes and businesses were also burnt to the ground. This was the spirit of Woodrow Wilson's Christmas in Dixie, and his love for the Klan. And where your national Christmas tree actually came from. December 2, 1951, the United Artists' release of A Christmas Carol, featuring the three evil spirits, directly out of Revelation chapter 16, verses 13 and 14, are spread throughout the country to defame anyone who refuses to do Christmas, as Ebenezer Scrooge, who is a completely fictional character in Charles Dickens' vain depraved imagination, to which he self-confessed, and subsequently held a several-hour bonfire to destroy the depravity of all his personal correspondence. It is called the bonfire at Gad's Hill Place. Then in 1957, a second-generation Lutheran counter-reformationist German immigrant created the iconic literature, The Grinch Who Stole Christmas, to subhumanize people who do not do Christmas, and torture every elementary school child who happens to be Jewish, with the same subhumanization that occurred in Nazi Germany. He had formerly been employed by the U.S. Army to conduct psychological warfare against the Nazis. Afterwards, he employed his skill at torturing Jewish elementary school children over their identity as Grinches. In 1962, a new technique of indoctrination and brainwashing began by flooding every available media outlet with constant Christmas propaganda. The first Christmas special featured an animation cartoon of Mr. Magoo, followed by the Peanuts, Charlie Brown character, also created by a Lutheran counter-reformationist. God was so pleased with their efforts in humiliating and torturing children that he gave them the first extinction-level red tide event in history, putting an entire town out of the sponge diving industry, and following it up with the longest recurring red tide in previous global history, lasting for an unbelievable 10 years. The last wave of red tide began in 1994. But as you can see from the graph, if this is really, in theological terms, attributable to God, and it clearly has to be, then God is not pleased with the direction of Christianity in America. It has now entered the phase where red tide is now a constant condition in Florida, without rest. As you have seen in the previous examples, for each evil that counter-reformationists did in history, God responded in like manner, in the form of red tide, or the second and third saucer judgment. To show the complete egregious nature of what America has done would take more time than can be extended to it here. But we will quickly hit some highlights, which will demonstrate that tsunami of red tide between 1994 and 2018 that is shown on the timeline. In 1964, the Eastern Orthodox Patriarch in the Western Papacy restored communion in anticipation of the New World Order, sold by Pope Paul VI in the Second Vatican Council. Previously known in biblical prophecy as the false prophet and the Antichrist. In 1965, the Archbishop of Canterbury, head of the Church of England, announced the papacy as the Bishop of Rome was a gift of authority and the head of the entire church. Previously known in the Westminster Confession as the Antichrist. In 1986, Antonin Scalia was unanimously appointed to the Supreme Court by all Democrats and Republicans, and who the University of Notre Dame named an interlegal school after, for his brilliant Catholic legal opinion that torture is not cruel and unusual punishment, as long as you don't intend to punish, when you torture, your victims, ending America's half-century compliance to the Geneva Conventions and international law. Various tortures of constitutional torture law were developed when George W. Bush wanted to freely torture his prisoners, following his now newfound Catholic heritage, and for deciding that Roe v. Wade should be overturned, thus forcing pregnant women carrying literally dead babies to full term, even when the fetus is rotting in their womb, or the fetus is so malformed, the woman will be forced to give birth to a mangled mass of tissue with one eyeball and no brain, or when a 13-year-old has been raped by her father or the priest, she should still be forced to bring it to term, even if it poses health risks, due to the immature biology of the rape victim. In 1990, we have George H. Bush Sr.'s brilliant speech, in which he declares a new world order, and explains that the Roman papacy could conveniently serve as the chaplain to the world. Even though, in his own Episcopalian history, the founders of that denomination named him the Antichrist. God was so impressed with President Bush's thinking that we all should appoint the Antichrist to be the chaplain of the world, that in 1994, God unleashed the first two-year continuous red tide in history, and followed it up with the first mass fish and manatee kill in documented history. Then in 1998, when a lawsuit was brought showing Christmas law requiring religious compulsion is unconstitutional, the Antonin Scalia opinion simply ignored the problem and said, no isn't, no matter what it is. God responded to the Supreme Court's judgment with his own judgment, with the first unbroken continuous red tide in history. Then in 2003, Bill O'Reilly launched the War on Christmas War, in which O'Reilly threatened to anyone that got in the way of full compulsion to Christmas of any kind for any reason at all. And he declared victory. God responded by unleashing the largest yet red tide in history, so incredibly large, it could be seen from outer space. It was so large and so severe, it was the first time in history that even the dogs began to get sick. In 2004, the immensely popular John Paul II gave the papal New World Order speech once again. God was so grateful to him for all that is doing for God that he unleashed an historical red tide so large, it created a massive dead zone as large as the entire state of Rhode Island. The largest ever seen on the planet. In 2013, the secret papal document was discovered by European police investigating child abuse by priests, entitled The Crime Line Solicitationes. It demands that no priest should ever answer, truthfully, under oath to criminal prosecutors over child sexual abuse or bestiality. In 2018, 5 years later, God responded with a red tide so severe and so frequent and so large, it was described as apocalyptic. These charts will be added to the other links, included in the video description box, below the video. In the previous sections of this video, you saw that the saucer judgments are attended with actual real aerial phenomena of unexplainable flying saucers that are both real and potentially dangerous. And they are seen all over the world. Yet despite appearing to be fully real, they do not appear to be anything related to alien life, or even anything from outer space. They fully materialize in the atmosphere, but then will vanish into thin air without a trace. You also saw, in history, that the first saucer judgment of terrible and painful skin sores have also already occurred, all over the world. And this phenomena correlates, on statistical maps, with both the density of Roman Catholicism in a given national region, and its frequency of the dangerous and potentially deadly skin sore, melanoma, caused by overexposure to the sun, which is worshipped as the Luciferian Christ in Christmas. And in the second saucer judgment, you discovered there has been a vast amount of propaganda that has intentionally tried to hide the actual truth about red tide, in terms of its increasing severity, its global presence, and what is known scientifically about its causes, which are directly attributable to human behaviors, such as utilitarian greed, government political officials, and the ever-present, habitual dishonesty of counter-reformationist, religious leaders. All of which, John also described in his prophecies. But prophesying, they would not repent. In the third saucer judgment, you discovered that the phenomena of cyanobacteria blooms are an increasing threat to human life, and the safety and availability of our drinking water sources. And you discovered, this too, is traceable to the increasing impacts of fertilizers and animal excrement from rural agriculture, and urban runoff from human development. In the next video, we will look at the next 3 saucer judgments, from the 4th, 5th and 6th saucer judgments. And we will see how much of Revelation has already been fulfilled in history, right under our own very eyes. In the last video on chapter 16, we will look at the final 7th saucer judgment, and review the 7 saucer judgments as fulfilled prophecy, which will bring us to the close of the age of the saucer judgments. Thank you for watching.